Every few years, there's a camera that comes out that's a massive jump in technology and it propels the whole industry forward, or sits out in front for a while at least. Usually this is because of a new feature or capability that is not necessarily new to the world, but new to the style of camera that we're talking about, like that mirrorless prosumer sort of camera. There's also some other features in the space that have also started becoming a bit more accessible as well. Namely 32-bit float on the Rode Wireless Pro, and even open gate like the Lumix S5 II and S5 IIX have. But let's talk about the big one first, global shutter. If you haven't heard the news, Sony recently announced their Alpha 9 Mark III, which is the first full-frame hybrid mirrorless camera with global shutter. Global shutter is when the sensor scans every single pixel at the exact same time rather than sequentially from top to bottom like rolling shutter does. Sony seems to be focusing on the photo capabilities of the global shutter, which are pretty good. 120 frames per second bursts with no blackout, shutter speed up to 1/80,000th of a second, and also no warping from rolling shutter because it doesn't have one. When shooting video with a rolling shutter camera, if there's any sort of fast movement, you can get some warping. And obviously the slower the rolling shutter, the worse it's gonna be. Now the sensor on the Sony a7S III, FX3 and FX6 is pretty good for this, it's pretty fast. But something like the Sony a7 IV is a little bit slower, around 30 milliseconds I'm pretty sure. So it's gonna be a little bit more noticeable. Global shutter on the new A9 III means you won't get any of that warping. Plus, it can shoot 4K up to 120 frames per second with no crop whatsoever. The FX3 can't even do that. It has about a 1.1 times crop when shooting 4K 120. Speaking of sensors, open gate is another feature that isn't that common, but I feel like it should be. The Lumix S5 II can shoot 6K open gate on its 3x2 sensor, and it's the same form factor as any other hybrid mirrorless camera, like the A7 IV. Now, 6,000 by 4,000 pixel video can be a lot of data to manage and a lot to process, so that's probably why it isn't done a whole lot, but the point is that it is possible, as is 32-bit float audio recording in a small form factor as seen in the Rode Wireless Pro. If you didn't see my video about this, go watch it after this one. But basically 32-bit float is like HDR for your ears, so it's basically impossible to make it peak. You can bring those louder sounds down in post, just as you can bring the quieter sounds up without introducing much noise because the noise floor is just so much lower. So since all of this is possible, here's what I want to see in new cameras in the next few years. And I'm going to use Sony as an example because that's what I'm familiar with, that's what I use. And they're also the ones that just released a full frame global shutter camera. I hope we see the next iteration of the FX3 and FX6 with a 24 megapixel global shutter, just like the one that's in the A9 III. The reason I say 24 megapixels is so that it can shoot 6K, so then if it could shoot 6K open gate, that would be ideal. One of the biggest issues with global shutter is dynamic range. However, no one's really said anything bad about the A9 III sensor when it comes to dynamic range. And Red cameras have global shutter and great dynamic range, so it's obviously possible. I also wonder if it is possible in the near future to include 32-bit recording for audio directly into camera. So if you have a 32-bit float recorder like the Rode Wireless Pro, if the signal from that going into the camera could then also be 32-bit, so then you have your 32-bit float in the video file itself. So you don't have to sync it later, you just have higher quality audio from the start. And then if you add raw video onto that, that would make it sort of the whole package. But Red still has their patent on compressed raw video at the moment, so we'll see what happens there. So this is for Sony. Please make a camera with all those features. And you, please go watch that video about what I wanted in my dream camera about a year ago. A lot of it hasn't really changed. Or, the Wireless Pro one that I mentioned before. And do all the other things. I'll see you next time. Okay, bye.